Hey, welcome back. Tonight we are taking a look at Family Guy, a talking dog, a talking baby, and a small town in Rhode Island that has never once stayed the same shape twice. For more than 20 years, the show has quietly contradicted itself about almost everything. If these calm videos are what you come here for, you can subscribe. It is free, so get comfortable and let us walk through nearly every plot hole the show ever left behind. The machine that was built to forget. There is a moment Family Guy has returned to, again and again over the years, and it is one of the strangest things the show does. Peter Griffin, with no warning and no reason, runs into a giant man-sized chicken, and the two of them begin to fight. The fight is enormous. It goes on far longer than any joke could possibly need. It smashes through storefronts, rolls out into traffic, crashes onto the wing of an airplane, tumbles across rooftops in foreign cities, and ends with both of them bloodied and gasping for breath, at which point Peter dusts himself off, says something polite, and simply walks back to whatever he was doing before, as if none of it ever happened. The chicken is almost never connected to the story around it. It arrives out of nowhere, eats up a minute or two of the episode, and then disappears, leaving no mark on anything. That fight is a good place to start, because it is the clearest possible example of the single most important thing about how Family Guy is built. The show runs on something called the cutaway gag. A cutaway gag is a joke that interrupts the story to show you something completely unrelated. The action stops, a character says a line like "this is worse than the time I did such and such," and the show cuts away to a short scene illustrating that unrelated thing. Then it cuts back, and the story picks up exactly where it left off, as though the detour never occurred. The detour is the joke. It does not move the plot forward. It does not develop the characters. And most importantly, it does not have to agree with anything else in the show. A cutaway can show Peter as a Roman soldier, as a cartoon character from the 1940s, as a man who has never met his own children, as a king, as a fish, as anything at all, and none of it counts. None of it has to be remembered the following week, or even in the following scene. When a show is built mostly out of jokes like that, something follows almost automatically. The show stops needing a memory. A traditional drama has to keep very careful track of its own past, because every episode is built on top of the ones before it, and a contradiction would crack the whole structure. If a character died last season, that character has to stay dead. If two people got married, they have to stay married, or the show has to do real work to explain why they did not. A show made mostly of self-contained jokes has none of that pressure. Each gag is its own tiny sealed world, cut off from all the others. If one gag tells you Peter cannot read, and another gag a few weeks later shows him reading a newspaper, neither one is wrong, because neither one was ever meant to be part of a single continuous record. They were both just jokes, and a joke only has to be true once, for the few seconds that it is on the screen. So the first piece of the machine is a comedy that does not have to remember itself. Sitting on top of that structure is a second idea, one shared by many long-running cartoons, but pushed here especially hard. It is called the sliding timeline. In a show with a sliding timeline, the calendar moves forward in the real world, and the show acknowledges the real world as it goes. The characters use the newest phones. They mention recent movies, recent technology, recent events. The setting is always, roughly, the present day, whatever the present day happens to be in the year an episode airs. But the characters themselves never age to match. Years pass outside the show, and inside it, everyone stays exactly where they were. The children never grow up. The baby never becomes a toddler. The parents never gray, never tire, never reach a single one of the milestones that real time forces on real people. The world slides forward underneath them, while they stand perfectly still. This creates contradictions all on its own, before anyone has made a single mistake. If a character is a teenager in 1999 and is still a teenager 25 years later, then every birthday, every line about how long ago something happened, every flashback to a character's younger days has to quietly disagree with every other one. The show cannot possibly keep all of that consistent, because the premise itself is not consistent. A person frozen in time, living inside a world that is not frozen, cannot have a history that holds together. So the sliding timeline does not cause the occasional error. It guarantees a permanent, renewing supply of them. The errors are not a sign that something went wrong. They are a sign that the machine is running exactly as designed. And then there is the third piece, which is less a technique than an attitude. Inside the writer's room, the governing question was never, is this consistent with what we already established? The governing question was, is this funny? If a joke needed Peter to have a long-lost brother, Peter could have a long-lost brother for the length of that one joke. If a joke needed Lois to have grown up poor instead of fabulously rich, she could have grown up poor for a single scene. The past was not a fixed record to be protected. It was raw material to be reshaped anytime a bigger laugh was sitting just on the other side of it. Writers sometimes call this the rule of funny, and on most shows it gets used carefully and rarely. On Family Guy, it was closer to a way of life. None of this happened in a vacuum, and the actual history of the show explains why these habits sank in so deep. Family Guy did not have a smooth and confident beginning. After its first few seasons, the ratings were unsteady, and the schedule was a mess, with the network moving the show around and burning off episodes in bad time slots. Around 2002, Fox effectively canceled it. For a while, it genuinely looked finished. A few stray episodes trickled out, and that appeared to be the end of the story. Then something unusual happened. The show found a second life, first in late-night cable reruns and then in sales of its episodes on DVD, and that second life turned out to be enormous. The reruns pulled in large and devoted audiences who had either missed the show the first time or had never stopped loving it. The DVD sets sold in numbers that startled nearly everyone, including the people who made them. And on the strength of that surprise, Fox did something it had almost never done before. It brought a canceled show back from the dead, ordering brand new episodes and returning Family Guy to the air in 2005, with a season premiere that joked about its own cancellation and revival. A show that had been pronounced dead was suddenly, improbably, alive again. A show that dies and comes back does not come back unchanged. People move on during the years away. New writers arrive who were not there at the beginning and do not carry the original memory of how everything fit together. The people writing the show in its later seasons were, in many cases, simply not the same people who had written it at the start, and they were working from their own personal sense of who these characters were, rather than from a shared original record. When the hands on a thing change, the small details drift. A piece of backstory that one set of writers invented can be quietly forgotten, or contradicted, or deliberately rewritten by the next set, and there is no one standing guard to stop it. The man at the center of the whole thing stepped back as well. Seth MacFarlane, who had shaped the early show closely and personally, gradually pulled away from the day-to-day writing as his career expanded into films and other television projects around the start of the 2010s. He stayed on as a producer, and he kept voicing his characters, so the voices never changed. But the detailed work of deciding what actually happened inside each episode increasingly belonged to other people. So most of the show's later contradictions were not produced by the person who built the world in the first place. They were produced by people who inherited it, the way you might inherit an old house from a relative and slowly, without quite meaning to, rearrange all the rooms until the place your relative built is not quite the place you live in anymore. It is worth slowing down on how strange this really is, because the strangeness is easy to miss when you are simply enjoying the jokes. Watch a handful of episodes made years apart, and you will see the town of Quahog quietly modernize around the family. The cars change. The phones in everyone's hands change. The movies the characters mention, the technology they argue over, the famous people they make fun of, all of it updates to match whatever year the episode came out. The world is allowed to move. The people are not. Lois is the same age in an episode built around a brand new piece of technology as she was in an episode from many years before, and the show never pauses to notice the gap, because noticing the gap would mean admitting the gap is there, and the gap is the price the show agreed to pay a very long time ago. The cutaways pile up the same way. In one episode, a cutaway will tell you something about Peter's past, and in another, a different cutaway will tell you something flatly incompatible with it, and the show simply trusts that you will never lay the two of them side by side. He has, across these little sealed scenes, been almost everything. A roadie, a soldier in more than one war, a figure standing at the edge of more famous historical moments than any single man could possibly have attended. Each of those is funny on its own, and not one of them is meant to join the others into a single coherent life. They are beads that never become a necklace. And because the show only ever asks you to look at one bead at a time, the contradictions between them never quite register while you are watching. They only appear later, when someone lines them all up on purpose, which is more or less what we are doing tonight. The reset reaches the whole family too, not just Peter. Quahog has been destroyed, frozen, flooded, overrun, and flattened in various episodes, and the next week it is whole again, with no one any worse for it. Characters have suffered injuries that would end a real life and walked them off by the following scene. The damage never accumulates, because accumulation is itself a kind of memory, and this is a show that does not keep one. Every episode begins more or less from the same untouched starting line, no matter what the last episode did to the world. That is not laziness. It is the only way a show with no memory can keep running forever. If the damage stuck, the show would eventually have to deal with it, and dealing with it would slow down the jokes. It is a strange way to build a show, and it is worth being honest that it has real costs as well as real benefits. A viewer who wants the satisfaction of a world that holds together will not find it here, and will be quietly frustrated every time a fact they remember turns out not to count. But a viewer who is simply there for the jokes will rarely even notice, because the jokes keep coming and the contradictions stay politely out of sight until someone goes looking for them. The show made its choice about which kind of viewer it was for a long time ago, and the contradictions we are about to walk through are simply the receipts. This is the thing to hold on to as we go. None of what follows is the story of a show that lost track of itself by accident. It is the story of a show that decided, on purpose and at the very beginning, that keeping track was not worth what it would cost. A program built to forget will forget, reliably and forever, and it will do it whether the people making it are careless or careful. The forgetting is not the bug The forgetting is the feature, working exactly as it was meant to. You can watch the entire machine work in one simple, almost silly fact. Peter Griffin has died, on screen, more than once, and it has never mattered. He has been killed, declared dead, mourned by his family, and then returned to perfect health by the next episode, with no explanation offered and none expected, because the show needs him alive and the show does not consider death to be binding. A program that will not let its own lead character stay dead is telling you something honest about itself. It is telling you that nothing that happens on it is permanent, because permanence was never the point. The reset is not a failure of the storytelling. The reset is the storytelling. So that is the engine, all three parts of it turning together. A style of comedy that never has to remember itself. A clock that freezes the people in place while the world keeps moving around them. And a writing philosophy that treats the past as a polite suggestion rather than a binding fact. Everything else we are going to look at tonight grows directly out of those three things. The contradictions are not bugs buried somewhere in the machine. They are the exhaust the machine gives off while it runs, and there is a great deal of it. And the purest proof of all of it is not a dropped storyline, and it is not a forgotten character. It is a baby who has been exactly 1 year old since the last century. Section 2. The baby who never grew up. Stewie Griffin has a birthday in one of the show's very first episodes. It aired on April 18, 1999, only a few months into the show's life, and it is a normal first birthday in every visible way. There is a party, there is a cake, there is a 1-year-old at the center of it, and then something quietly remarkable happens, which is that for years and years afterward, Stewie does not have another one. He turns one, and then the show simply leaves him there. Stewie is the sharpest example in the entire series of the sliding timeline made flesh. He has been a 1-year-old for the show's entire run, across more than 2 decades of real time. Episodes that air many years apart will reference the newest gadgets and the newest movies, placing themselves firmly in whatever year they happen to come out. Stewie, in those same episodes, is still 1. He attends preschool. He goes on adventures that clearly take place long after his first birthday. The calendar around him keeps turning, and he never moves off the single age the show assigned him at the start. There is a clear reason the show refuses to let him grow, and the reason is the joke. The whole comedy of Stewie is the gap between what he is and what he can do. He is an infant who cannot walk to the kitchen on his own, and he is also a criminal mastermind with the vocabulary of a university professor, an elaborate British accent, a working knowledge of advanced weaponry, and a long-running, half-serious plan to kill his own mother. The humor lives entirely in that contradiction. A tiny, helpless body wrapped around an enormous, sinister mind. If Stewie aged, the contradiction would loosen and then disappear. A scheming 5-year-old is a much smaller joke than a scheming infant. A scheming teenager is no joke at all. So the show pays a price to protect the premise. The price is a child who lives outside of time, and the show pays it gladly, every single season. The show is also aware enough of the freeze to wink at it. In a much later episode in the 12th season, there is a gag that plays with the idea of Stewie finally turning 2, treating his second birthday almost as a special event precisely because it has been withheld for so long. It is a small joke, but it only works because everyone watching understands, somewhere in the back of their mind, that this baby has been the same age for an impossibly long time. The show knows. It is counting on you to know too. That frozen age is the headline contradiction, but Stewie carries smaller ones as well, and they are worth looking at because they show the same machinery from Section 1 working in miniature. Consider the single most recognizable thing about how Stewie looks, which is the strange, elongated football shape of his head. The show tells you more than one story about where that shape came from. In one episode, a flashback explains that Stewie's head was a normal, round baby's head, until he was jumping on a bed, shot up too high, and slammed into the ceiling, which flattened his skull into the long shape we know. It is a clean little origin story for his appearance. The problem is that in other flashbacks, including ones reaching all the way back to his birth, Stewie already has the football head. He is born with it, so the most famous feature of his entire design has 2 different origins, a born-with-it version and an accident version, and the 2 cannot both be true. They were never meant to both be true. They were each just a joke, made in a different episode, sealed off from the other, exactly the way the cutaway logic predicts. Then there is the deepest and most slippery inconsistency of all, which is the simple question of who can actually understand him. Stewie speaks constantly, in full and complicated sentences, delivering long monologues and detailed plans out loud. And most of the time, the adults around him do not react to a word of it. Peter and Lois treat him as an ordinary, babbling baby, as if all of that eloquent speech is reaching their ears as nothing but coos and cries. But Brian, the family dog, understands Stewie perfectly, and the 2 of them talk to each other as equals all the time, holding entire conversations, arguing, scheming, and going on adventures together built entirely on the fact that they understand one another. And then, in still other episodes, ordinary adults will suddenly understand Stewie just fine, responding to exactly the kind of speech that Peter and Lois never seem to hear. The rule changes changes from scene to scene, depending on what each scene needs. The show is so aware of this that it once staged an argument about it inside the show itself. In an episode from the later seasons, Brian and Stewie openly debate whether a particular character was ever able to understand Stewie's speech, treating their own inconsistent rule as something to bicker about rather than something to fix. When a program stops to have its characters argue about its own broken rule, it is telling you, as plainly as it can, that the rule was never fixed in the first place. It is not a law of the world. It is a setting, adjusted as needed, and occasionally joked about when someone notices the dial has moved. Even Stewie's deepest sense of himself drifts in the same way. Over the years, the show has pointed in several different directions about Stewie's identity and who he is attracted to, dropping a hint one way in one episode and then pulling firmly in the other direction in another, never landing in a fixed place and never reconciling the various hints with one another. Taken purely as a matter of continuity, it is one more trait the show never locked down, picked up and put down again as each individual episode found it useful. The same as his age, the same as his head, the same as the question of who can hear him. It is worth lingering on just how completely the show commits to keeping him there, because the commitment is total. Stewie has gone to preschool. He has had teachers and classmates and school events. He has done, in plain sight, dozens of things that would carry a one-year-old well past the age of 1, and through all of it, the show has held the line that he is still, officially, a baby of 12 months. There is no moment where the show sits you down and announces that time has passed. Time simply passes, invisibly and constantly, in the references and the technology and the world, while Stewie is carried along on that current without ever gaining a single day. He is a fixed point in a moving river. You can measure the size of the joke by imagining it taken away. Picture Stewie exactly as he behaves. The elaborate schemes, the withering insults, the long speeches about world domination, the secret laboratory full of impossible machines, and then picture all of it coming out of a child of 4, or 7, or 12. The older you make him, the less astonishing it becomes, until at some point it is not astonishing at all, just a precocious kid. The humor depends entirely on the body being as small and as helpless as it can be, while the mind is as large and as dangerous as it can be. Stretch the body even a little, and the whole thing sags. So the show refuses to stretch it, ever, and accepts every contradiction that refusal creates as simply the cost of keeping the joke at full strength. Return for a moment to the head. The two stories the show tells about it are not vague impressions that happen to clash. They are specific, deliberate scenes, each one built to land a laugh, each presented as if it were simply how things are. The bed story is a complete little narrative, with a cause and an effect, a child bouncing too high and a ceiling doing the rest. The Born With It story is just as definite, showing the shape present from the very first moment of his life. Neither is hedged, neither winks at the other. The show is not confused about which one is true. It simply does not care which one is true, because truth, in the sense of a single fact that holds across every episode, was never something it set out to provide. It set out to provide jokes, and a joke that needs a flat head can have one for any reason it likes. The question of who can understand him is the richest of these, because it sits at the very center of the character, and the show breaks it constantly. Think about what is actually required for Stewie to work at all. He has to be understood by someone, or his speeches are just noise and there is no comedy in them. And he has to not be understood by his parents, or the central joke of a scheming baby hiding in plain sight collapses. The show needs both things to be true at once, so it simply makes both things true, scene by scene, depending on which one the moment requires. Brian understands him because Brian is his partner in nearly every plot, and the plots need two people who can talk. Peter and Lois do not understand him because the comedy of a baby plotting under his parents' noses needs the parents oblivious, and the random adults who suddenly understand him in this episode or that one are there because that particular scene happened to need a listener. There is no rule being followed. There is only the need of the moment, met again and again, in whatever way the moment demands. This is why the moment when the show argues with itself about it is so telling. When Brian and Stewie stop, inside the story, to disagree about whether someone could ever understand Stewie, the show is not resolving the inconsistency. It is doing the opposite. It is acknowledging, out loud, that the inconsistency exists, and then turning that acknowledgement into one more joke instead of into a fix. A show that intended to keep the rule straight would simply keep it straight. A show that turns its own broken rule into material has told you that the rule was never the point. The break is more useful than the rule, so the break stays, and the show would rather laugh about it than mend it. The second birthday gag is worth one more look, because of what it quietly admits. For the show to make a joke out of Stewie finally turning 2, it has to assume that you, the viewer, already know he has been stuck at 1 for an unnaturally long time. The humor depends on your awareness of the freeze. A first birthday is just a birthday. A second birthday, treated as a strange and remarkable event, is only funny if everyone in the room understands that this baby should have had many birthdays by now and has somehow had none. So the joke is not really about Stewie aging. It is about the show acknowledging, with a wink, that it has refused to let him age, and inviting you to find that refusal funny rather than strange. It is the sliding timeline tipping its hat to the audience. The show is not hiding the contradiction from you. It is sharing it with you, confident that you have noticed it too, and turning the very thing that should break the illusion into one more small joke that the illusion somehow survives. Even the deeper, more personal questions about Stewie follow the same pattern of being raised, dropped, and raised again differently. Over the long life of the show, his sense of who he is has been pointed in more than one direction. A hint laid down in one episode, and then a contradicting hint laid down in another. None of them ever settling into a single fixed fact about the character. Taken strictly as a matter of continuity, and setting everything else aside, it is simply one more trait the show declined to nail down. It picked the trait up when an episode found it useful, set it back down when the episode was over, and felt no obligation to make this week's version agree with last year's. The character is not being developed across time. He is being reassembled, slightly differently, every time the show reaches for him. Even Stewie's abilities refuse to hold still from one episode to the next. In some stories, he is a genuine super genius, building time machines and weather machines and devices that bend reality itself, a mind beyond any adult on the show. In others, he is just a clever baby, capable of a scheme or two, but nowhere near that level. His impossible inventions nowhere in sight. The show scales his intelligence up and down to fit whatever a given episode needs, a world-conquering inventor one week, and an ordinary, if precocious, toddler the next. Like everything else about him, his genius is not a fixed trait, but a dial, turned as high or as low as the joke of the moment requires, with no concern for what last week's episode established him as being able to do. Put all of it together and you do not really have a character with a history. You have a 1-year-old who has been 1 year old for more than 20 years, whose most famous feature has two competing origins, whom his own parents can and cannot understand depending on the day, and whose deepest traits shift to fit the moment. That is not a flaw in how Stewie was written. That is the sliding timeline and the cutaway logic in their purest, most concentrated form, all of it poured into the smallest member of the family. Stewie is not a person the show is keeping track of. He is a bundle of excellent jokes, wearing the same little outfit every day, standing exactly where the show set him down on the day it first met him. If this kind of long look at something you grew up with is what you come here for, subscribe. It's free, and it tells us these videos are worth making. And if the show could freeze a child outside of time and never blink, then it could do something stranger still. It could reach back into the life of a grown man and quietly swap out his father. Section 3. The Fathers Who Weren't For. The first 4 seasons of the show, there was no mystery at all about who Peter's father was. His name was Francis Griffin. He was a harsh, sour, deeply religious man, forever disapproving of Peter and forever disappointed in him, and he turned up in episode after episode in exactly that role, the stern Irish Catholic father looming over his grown son. The relationship was not a passing gag. It was a fixed, established, load-bearing part of the show, returned to again and again over years of episodes. Peter had a father, and his father was Francis, and that was simply the truth of the world. And then, in a single episode, the show reached back and erased it. The episode is called Peter's Two Dads. It is the 10th episode of the 5th season, and it aired on February 11th, 2007. It begins with a death. At Meg's birthday party, Peter is doing a foolish stunt on a unicycle, loses control, and accidentally crushes and kills Francis. That alone would be a large event for most shows, the on-screen death of an established parent. But the death is not the real shock of the episode. The real shock comes afterward, when Peter learns that Francis, the man who raised him and judged him and stood over him for his entire life, was never his biological father in the first place. Peter's real father, the episode reveals, is an Irishman named Mickey McFinnigan. Years before, Peter's mother had traveled to Ireland and had an affair, and Mickey was the result of it. Peter, newly fatherless and newly informed, travels to Ireland to find this man, and discovers that Mickey is the town drunk, a staggering, red-faced figure famous mainly for being able to outdrink everyone around him. The episode ends with Peter having effectively traded one father for another, replacing the stern man who raised him with the falling-down stranger who fathered him. There is a word for what this episode did, and it is worth pausing to define it clearly, because it is going to come up again and again tonight. The word is retcon. It is short for retroactive continuity, and it describes the moment when a story reaches back into its own past and changes it, declaring that something which was always presented as true was actually never true at all. A retcon is not the same as simply telling a new story. It is telling you that the old story, the one you already watched and believed, did not really happen the way you were shown. Peter's Two Dads is a retcon in its purest form. 4 seasons of one fact, reversed in 22 minutes. So why do it? Why throw away 4 years of an established relationship? The answer, which the show's own creator has given, is almost startlingly practical. Seth MacFarlane has explained that he had always privately pictured Peter's true father not as Francis, but as a fat, drunk, leprechaun-like Irish Irishman, and that Francis, who was written as relentlessly negative and disapproving, had simply become dull to write for. A character whose only note is disappointment runs out of jokes. So the show did the most Family Guy thing imaginable. It decided the new idea was funnier than the old fact, and it changed the fact. The retcon was not an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate creative choice, made because a fresh joke was judged to be worth more than 4 seasons of continuity. The past lost, and the punchline won. If the show had done this only once, to only one character, you might call it a bold one-time swing. But it did the very same thing to a second member of the same family, and it did it years earlier, played for a darker and quieter laugh. The character is Meg, the oldest Griffin child, and the episode is called Screwed the Pooch from the 3rd season. In the middle of a courtroom scene, Brian the dog blurts out a piece of information that should detonate the entire family. He announces that Meg is not actually Peter's daughter, that her real biological father is a man named Stan Thompson. It is the kind of revelation that, on almost any other show, would reshape everything that followed it. An admitted secret about the parentage of a main character dropped in open court. And then the show does something perfectly characteristic. It lets the bombshell land, and it lets it vanish. Meg herself, sitting right there in the room, is wearing headphones, and so she never hears the thing that was just said about her own life. The reveal happens, gets its laugh, and is simply dropped, never to seriously reshape anything. Meg's origins do not stop shifting there. Over the years, the show rewrites the circumstances of her birth again and again, each time for a new gag, and never once worries about lining the versions up. There is a joke that she was born a boy. There is a joke involving a strange mark she was born with. There is a joke about what her birth certificate says. There is a joke about her being left somewhere as an infant. None of these are reconciled with one another, because none of them were ever meant to be the truth. They are each a sealed little cutaway, made in a different episode, and the show has no interest in choosing between them. Meg does not have a single origin. She has a drawer full of them, and the show pulls out whichever one is funniest that week. The show is even aware enough to connect its own 2 retcons. When Peter is reeling from the news about Mickey, he draws the comparison out loud, noting that he is now to Meg exactly what Mickey is to him, a father who turns out not to be the real father after all. The writers know they have done this twice. They are not hiding it. They are rhyming it, turning their own willingness to rewrite the family tree into a small joke about itself. It is worth dwelling on how solid the Francis relationship was before the show dissolved it, because the solidity is exactly what makes the reversal so striking. Francis was not a one-time guest who showed up, made an impression, and vanished. He came back, over and over, across 4 seasons. He was the source of recurring tension and recurring jokes. He had a personality the audience knew well, the rigid faith, the contempt for Peter's choices, the particular flavor of guilt he carried into every room. He was, in every functional sense, Peter's father, established as thoroughly as anything on the show was established. None of that protected him. When a fresher idea came along, 4 seasons of groundwork turned out to weigh almost nothing. The trip to Ireland that follows the revelation is its own small study in how lightly the show holds its own drama. Peter goes searching for the father he never knew he had, which is, on paper, the emotional spine of an entire episode, the sort of journey other shows would treat with real weight. Family Guy treats it as a setup for a string of drinking jokes. Mickey McFinnigan, when Peter finally finds him, is less a long-lost parent than a punchline with legs, the town's champion drinker, a staggering figure whose main function is to be funny and to be Irish in the broadest possible strokes. The reunion of a man and the father he never knew is played almost entirely for laughs, because the reunion was never the goal. The new joke was the goal, and the new father is the joke, and the emotional weight of the situation is spent as fast as the show can spend it. Meg's shifting origins deserve a closer look too, because the sheer number of them is the point. It is not simply that the show once said something odd about her birth. It is that the show has said many odd and incompatible things about her birth, again and again, across years, with no version ever winning out. There is the running suggestion about her real father, there are the jokes about the circumstances of her arrival, about what was written down when she was born, about being unwanted or misplaced as an infant. Stacked together, they do not form a story. They form a pile, a heap of contradictory gags, all aimed at the same target, which is Meg as the family's perpetual punching bag. The contradictions are not a problem the show is failing to solve. They are simply more ammunition, and the show reaches for whichever piece of it lands hardest in any given scene. That the show draws the line between its 2 retcons itself, having Peter note that he is now to Meg what Mickey is to him, is the most revealing detail of all. A show embarrassed by its own inconsistency would bury it. This show points at it. It has rewritten the fatherhood of 2 members of the same family, and rather than hope no one notices, it gathers the 2 rewrites together and makes a small joke out of the pattern. The willingness to do that is the whole sensibility in miniature. The contradiction is not a wound to be hidden. It is a feature to be enjoyed, even shown off, because the show is not in the business of being consistent. It is in the business of being funny, and there is a real sly joke in a man realizing he has become, to his own daughter, exactly the absent stranger he just found at the root of his own life. There is also also the question of what happens to everything that was built on top of the old fact, and the answer is that the show simply lets it dangle. 4 seasons of Peter and Francis had produced their own small history. The arguments, the disappointments, the specific shape of a difficult father and a son who could never please him. When the show reveals that Francis was never the real father, it does not go back and reweigh any of that. It does not ask what it means that Peter spent his whole life trying to satisfy a man who was not even his blood. It just drops the new fact into place and moves forward, leaving the old relationship sitting there, suddenly resting on nothing. On a show that cared about continuity, that loose thread would be a problem to be addressed. Here it is not even noticed, because the show was never building a continuous emotional history in the first place. It was building a series of episodes, each complete in itself, and an episode does not have to account for the ones that came before it. The old father served his episodes, the new father serves his. Neither one owes the other an explanation. It is worth naming plainly what a retcon costs and why a show would pay it. The cost is trust, in a small way. Every time a series reaches back and changes a fact you had already accepted, it teaches you, a little, not to get too attached to anything it tells you, because anything it tells you might be unwritten later. Most shows guard against that carefully, spending their retcons rarely, because they want you to believe in their world. Family Guy spends them freely, because it has made a different bet. It has bet that you are not watching for the world, you are watching for the jokes, and a great joke today is worth more than a consistent fact tomorrow. By that math, a retcon is not a cost at all. It is just a trade, and the show makes the trade gladly, over and over, confident that you will keep laughing, even as the ground keeps shifting under the characters' feet. Notice, too, that in both cases the rewrite lands on the question of fatherhood in particular. It is not a coincidence that the 2 biggest family retcons in the show are both about who someone's father really is. Fatherhood is supposed to be the most fixed fact there is, the thing a person can stand on no matter what else changes around them. By choosing to rewrite exactly that twice, the show is making its position about as clear as it can possibly make it. The instability is not confined to fathers either. The wider family tree is just as loosely held. Peter's mother drifts in and out of the show with a history that never quite settles. Relatives appear for a single episode and are never spoken of again, and grandparents materialize when a story needs them and vanish when it does not. The Griffins, like every family on the show, are less a fixed lineage than a flexible supply of relatives, expanded and contracted to fit whatever a given episode requires. A new aunt, a forgotten cousin, a grandparent with a convenient backstory, any of them can be summoned for one joke and then quietly returned to non-existence, because the family tree, like the fathers hanging from it, was never built to bear any real weight. And that is really the point of this whole section, the thing underneath both of these retcons. A show that will quietly rewrite who your parents are has told you something fundamental about its priorities. It has told you that it does not consider the family tree to be load-bearing. On most shows, the family is the one truly fixed thing, the stable center that everything else is allowed to orbit. The jobs can change and the neighbors can come and go, but the family is supposed to be solid, because the family is the whole reason you are watching. Family Guy does not treat its family that way. The relationships are real enough to generate jokes, and not one single inch more fixed than the jokes happen to require. When the parentage of 2 of the 5 main members of the family can be swapped out without the show breaking stride, you begin to understand what you are really watching. It is not a family drama with comedy laid on top of it. It is a joke delivery machine that happens to be shaped, conveniently, like a family. A swapped-out father was not the only piece of the past this show was willing to rewrite. Some of its characters were walking around for years with origin stories that were never true to begin with, and one of them was a lie the character told on purpose. Section 4. The stories that turned out to be lies. Joe Swanson is the Griffin's neighbor across the street, a broad-shouldered, barrel-chested police officer who uses a wheelchair, and he carries his backstory like a badge. In his earliest appearances, reaching back to his very first episode in the first season, Joe explains how he ended up paralyzed, and the story is a heroic one. He was at an orphanage on Christmas Eve, defending the children's presents from the Grinch, the green creature famous for trying to steal Christmas. And during the struggle, he fell from the roof. The fall took the use of his legs. It is the kind of story that is half noble and half absurd. A cop crippled in a rooftop fight with a holiday cartoon villain, and for years it was simply, reliably, Joe's story. It was who he was. And then, years later, the show took it back. The episode is called Joe's Revenge. It is the 5th episode of the 11th season, and it aired on November 18th, 2012. In it, Joe reveals that the Grinch story was never true. It was a cover story, something he had been telling for years in place of the real thing. The truth, he admits, is that he was shot. While working undercover, he was gunned down by a fugitive drug kingpin named Bobby the Shirt Briggs, and that bullet, not any fall, is what put him in the chair. The entire episode is built around Joe finally tracking Briggs down to settle the score. The defining injury of a major character, reassigned from a comic cause to a violent one, years after the fact. Joe's condition is unstable in other directions too, beyond just the question of its cause. There is an episode in which a surgery allows Joe to walk again for a while, restoring the use of his legs before the show eventually returns him to the wheelchair where it needs him. So the single most defining physical fact about the character has more than one origin story and, at different points, more than one status. He was paralyzed by the Grinch, and then he was paralyzed by a bullet, and for one stretch he was not paralyzed at all. The point here is not the chair itself, which the show generally treats as simply part of who Joe is. The point is that even something this central and this serious, was not a fixed fact the show kept faithfully. It was rewritten when a story called for it, and a story did call for it, which is the whole explanation. A revenge plot needs a villain, and it needs a wound with a face attached to it, a specific person who can be hunted down and confronted at the end. The Grinch is a joke. You cannot build a real, driving revenge arc on top of a joke, because the joke gives you nothing to chase. So the show reached back into Joe's past and replaced the cause of his injury with something it could actually use, something with a name and a body and a location. The old version was funnier. The new version was more useful. Faced with that choice, the show chose useful and quietly overwrote the rest. Brian, the family dog, offers a gentler version of the same habit, a character with more than one origin and an age that simply cannot be true. The show has told more than one story about how Brian came to live with the Griffins, the most familiar being that Peter found him as a stray, begging for change on the side of the road, and took him in. But the deeper problem with Brian is not how he arrived. It is the basic arithmetic of his life, which the show never even tries to make work. Brian is repeatedly said to be around 7 or 8 years old, and yet Brian has a son, a teenage boy named Dylan, who is plainly older than Brian himself could possibly be. A 7-year-old cannot have a 13-year-old child. When the contradiction is pointed at directly, the show does not solve it. It waves a hand and says the words dog years, as if simply naming the idea were the same thing as explaining it. It is not an explanation. It is a punchline standing where an explanation would go, which on this show is frequently the same thing. It helps to sit with the original story for a moment, because it was never a throwaway. Joe's account of his injury was part of who Joe was from the very beginning. He told it with the same straight-faced pride he brought to everything, the decorated officer who had given his legs in the line of a strange and noble duty. The details were specific: an orphanage, Christmas Eve, the Grinch, of all villains, threatening the children's presence, a rooftop struggle, and a fall. It was absurd, and it was also genuinely heroic in the show's cartoon logic, and for a long stretch of episodes it was simply the truth about Joe, repeated and referenced and never once questioned. The audience knew it the way the audience knew Joe's name. So when Joe's revenge arrives and calmly takes it all back, the show is not patching a small hole. It is rewriting the single most defining fact about a major character, and it is doing so for a very specific reason. The episode wants to send Joe on a hunt. It wants a real antagonist, a man with a name and a face, someone Joe can pursue and confront and finally face down. Bobby the Shirt Briggs is built to be that man, a fugitive drug kingpin who shot Joe during an undercover operation and then disappeared. With that revision in place, the episode has its engine, a wronged cop chasing the criminal who crippled him. The Grinch could never have powered that story, because you cannot chase a holiday cartoon to the ends of the earth and shoot it down at the climax. So the Grinch was quietly demoted from fact to fib, and a usable villain was installed in his place. And the cause of the injury is not even the only part of it that moves. There is an episode in which Joe, through a surgery, regains the use of his legs and walks again, striding around Quahog upright for a while before the show, needing him back in the chair where it knows how to right him, returns him to it. So across the run of the series, the most basic physical facts about Joe have been genuinely unstable. The chair has had two different origins, a fall and a bullet, and it has at one point not been there at all. This is worth handling carefully and plainly, because Joe's disability is a real part of the character, and the show generally treats it as simply part of who he is. The point being made here is not about the chair itself. The point is about the storytelling. Even a fact this central, this serious, this defining, was never something the show held still. It moved it when a story wanted it moved, and that is the whole pattern in a single character. There is a small, revealing logic in which version the show chose to keep. The Grinch story was, by a wide margin, the funnier of the two. A heroic fall in a rooftop fight with a holiday villain is a joke. A bullet from a drug dealer is not a joke at all. By the show's usual instincts, you would expect it to keep the funnier version and discard the grim one. But this time it did the reverse, because this time it needed something the funny version could not give it. It needed a story, a real one, with a beginning and a target and an end, so it kept the useful version over the funny one. That is the rule of funny meeting its only real rival, which is the rule of whatever the episode needs, and when those two collide, need usually wins. The show will sacrifice even a good joke when a good joke stands in the way of a good story, and it will sacrifice a fact without a second thought either way. Brian, the family dog, carries a softer version of the same disease, and his is almost more telling for being so quiet. The show has offered more than one account of how Brian came to live with the Griffins. The most familiar is the roadside story, Peter spotting a stray begging for change and taking him home. But the deeper trouble with Brian is not the question of his arrival. It is the simple, unfixable arithmetic of his life. The show says, more than once, that Brian is about 7 or 8 years old. The show also gives Brian a son, a teenager named Dylan, a boy who is plainly older than 7 or 8. A creature of 7 cannot be the father of a teenager. The numbers do not bend, they break, and the show knows they break. And its entire response to the break is to say dog years and move on. That phrase, dog years, is worth pausing on, because it is doing a particular kind of work. It is not an explanation. Dog years, used properly, are just a way of comparing how a dog ages to how a person does, and they do not actually resolve anything about how a 7-year-old has a 13-year-old child. What the phrase really does is wave at the problem in a way that sounds like an answer while being none, and then dare you to keep pressing. It is a punchline standing exactly where an explanation belongs, which on this show is frequently the very same spot. The show is not embarrassed that the math fails. It has turned the failure into a tiny joke, and a tiny joke, as far as this show is concerned, is a perfectly good thing to find at the bottom of a contradiction. Better a laugh than a fix. Put Joe and Brian beside each other and the shape of the thing is clear. One is a dramatic rewrite, the cause of a paralysis swapped out to fuel a revenge plot. The other is a quiet impossibility, an age that cannot coexist with a child, papered over with a 2-word joke. They look different on the surface. Underneath, they are the same move. In both, a fact about a character that ought to be fixed, the origin of an injury, the age of a person, turns out to be provisional, kept in place only as long as it is convenient, and altered or ignored the moment it is not. The show is not tracking these facts in any master record. There is no document somewhere that states how old Brian is or how Joe was hurt. There is only the need of the current scene, and the facts rearrange themselves to meet it. This is, in a way, the most honest thing the show does, even if it does it by accident. Most series pretend that their characters have real and fixed histories, and then work hard to maintain the pretense, hoping you never catch the seams. Family Guy barely pretends. It hands a character a backstory, uses it for as long as the backstory is funny or useful, and then, without ceremony, hands the same character a different one. Joe's heroism, Brian's age, the road where Brian was found, the orphanage, the Grinch, none of these are anchors. They are props, brought out for a scene and put back in the bin, and the show feels no more loyalty to last season's prop than a stage crew feels to last night's set. It is tempting to call all of this carelessness, but carelessness is the wrong word. Carelessness would mean the show was trying to keep these facts straight and simply failing. That is not what is happening. The show is not trying. It has decided, deliberately, that these facts are not worth keeping straight, and it spends its effort accordingly, pouring everything into the jokes and nothing into the bookkeeping. The result looks like sloppiness from the outside, but from the inside, it is a choice, made over and over, about where the show's attention is worth spending. It is also worth noticing what the show gains by working this way, because it does gain something real. A series that refuses to be bound by its characters' histories is a series that can do anything with them at any time. It never has to turn down a good episode idea because the idea conflicts with something established 3 seasons ago. It never has to write around its own past. Every character is always fully available, ready to become whatever the next story needs, unburdened by the weight of everything they have already been. That freedom is precisely what produces the contradictions, and it is also, not by accident, part of what has let the show keep generating new material for so many years. The same refusal to remember that creates the plot holes also keeps the well from running dry. Lois carries her own collection of rewritten histories, each one revealed as if it had always been true and then quietly dropped. In one episode, her past holds a wild secret of one kind. In another, a completely different one. A string of hidden lives, old flames, and buried scandals that do not fit together into any single coherent person. Each is produced for the length of an episode, treated as a real and shocking revelation about who Lois used to be, and then forgotten, never reconciled with the others. The pattern is the one we keep meeting. A character's past is not a fixed record, but a drawer the show can reach into for whatever surprise a story needs, pulling out a new secret history each time, and never minding that the drawer holds a dozen versions that cannot all be real, and never lined up. So the lesson of this section is that the show treats an origin story the way it treats a job, or a haircut, or a piece of furniture. It is disposable. It is kept only as long as it is useful, and replaced the moment a better story walks in the door. The true version of a character's past is not decided in advance and then protected. It is simply whatever the current episode needs it to be. Joe's wound, the status of Joe's legs, Brian's age, the roadside where Brian was supposedly found, these are not facts the show is keeping careful track of in some master record. They are dials, turned to whatever position makes the next scene work, and turned back, or turned somewhere else entirely, the moment the next scene after that needs something different. If this kind of long look at something you grew up with is what you come here for, subscribe. It's free. free, and it tells us these videos are worth making. When even the story of how a man was injured can be rewritten on a whim, the story of how two people first fell in love never really stood a chance. Section 5. The Day They Met and the Other Day They Met. There are two complete, detailed, and entirely incompatible stories about how Peter and Lois Griffin first met and fell in love. This matters more than almost any other contradiction in the show, because Peter and Lois are the two people the entire series is built around. Their marriage is the foundation everything else stands on, and the show cannot keep its own foundation straight. The first version comes from Peter, Caviar Eater, the first episode of the second season, which aired on September 23, 1999. The story it tells is a class story, a poor boy and a rich girl. Peter, who came from a modest, working-class background, met Lois, who came from enormous family wealth because he had been hired as a lowly attendant for her family, a towel boy. The whole charm of the meeting is the gap between them, the servant and the heiress, falling for each other across a divide of money and status. It is a specific, complete origin, and for years it was the origin. The second version comes from Meet the Quagmires, the 18th episode of the 5th season, which aired on May 20th, 2007. Here the story is completely different. Peter and Lois are shown meeting as 18-year-olds at a country club in the very specific year of 1984, two young people falling in love in a moment the episode treats with real importance. There is no towel boy here. There is no servant and heiress. There are just two teenagers at a club in the 1980s, and the year matters enormously, because the year is the whole reason the episode exists. The reason the second version exists at all is parody. Meet the Quagmires is a send-up of Back to the Future, the 1985 film in which a teenager accidentally travels into the past and interferes with the moment his own parents first fell in love, threatening his own existence in the process. To do that parody, Family Guy needed Peter to be a young man at a fixed point in the past, meeting Lois for the very first time, so that he could go back and relive that moment and put it in danger. The towel boy origin simply did not fit the shape of the parody it wanted to make. So the towel boy origin was quietly set aside, and a brand new meeting was invented to fit the joke. The show did not reconcile the two stories, did not explain how both could be true, did not even acknowledge the older one. It just told the version it needed for the episode it was making. The same flexibility extends to how Peter met the rest of the people in his life. In an episode called Death Lives, Peter's first meetings with his friends are laid out one way. He meets Quagmire, the show suggests, while serving in the Navy, and he meets Cleveland, his other close friend, back in the 1970s. But in Meet the Quagmires, Peter and Lois and Quagmire are already running around together at that 1984 country club, friends already, with no Navy ship in sight. The accounts simply do not line up. Each first meeting was written to serve the particular episode it appeared in, and no single version of any of them was ever treated as the real and final one. And if you try to be a careful viewer, if you take out a calendar and genuinely attempt to place all of these meetings in order, the whole thing falls apart in your hands. The Navy meeting and the country club meeting cannot both be the first time Peter met Quagmire. The teenage romance in 1984 sits uneasily on top of the towel boy origin, with no room for both. And waiting underneath all of it is an even larger problem that we will reach in just a moment, because one of the people standing at that 1984 country club, laughing along as an 18-year-old, has an official document elsewhere in the show that says he was already a grown man years and years before that night could ever have happened. The math does not merely strain, it openly breaks. It is worth telling the first version properly, because it is a genuinely good origin, and the show clearly believed in it for years. Peter, in this account, is a young man of no money and no status, and Lois belongs to a family of almost absurd wealth, the kind of old money that summers at clubs and keeps staff. Peter enters her world from the very bottom, hired on as a towel boy, one of the invisible workers who keep a rich family comfortable. The romance grows across that gap, the heiress and the servant, and the gap is not just background, it is the whole point. It explains the lasting friction between Peter and Lois's father, a man who never stopped seeing Peter as the help who got above himself. For years, this was simply how Peter and Lois began, a complete story with its own logic and its own consequences threaded through later episodes. The second version does not modify the first. It replaces it wholesale. In it, Peter and Lois are both teenagers, both 18, meeting at a country club in 1984 and falling for each other there. The class gap is gone, or at least set aside. The towel is gone. The careful little story of the servant and the heiress is simply not present, and in its place is a clean teen romance pinned to a single, specific year. And that year is not chosen at random or for flavor. The year is load-bearing. The entire episode depends on it, because the entire episode is built to do one particular joke. The joke is a parody of Back to the Future, the 1985 film in which a teenage boy is thrown back in time to the year his own parents met and accidentally interferes with their first meeting so badly that he begins to erase himself from existence and has to scramble to push them back together before he disappears. years. To stage that story with the Griffins, the show needs a fixed past moment when Peter and Lois first fell in love, a specific night it can send a character back to and put in danger. It needs that moment to be dateable, visitable, breakable. The Towel Boy origin, sprawling and gradual, gives it no single breakable night. So the show invents one. It manufactures a first meeting at a precise time and place, 1984, a country club, two teenagers, purpose-built to serve the time travel plot. The older origin is not reconciled with the new one. It is not even mentioned. It is simply stepped over because it is in the way, and a show that steps over its own established history without breaking stride is a show telling you exactly how much that history was ever worth to it. The friends get the same treatment, and the contradictions there are just as plain once you set the episodes side by side. In Death Lives, the show lays out how Peter met the men who would become his closest friends, and it places those meetings in particular times and settings. Quagmire, in that telling, enters Peter's life through the Navy. Cleveland enters it back in the 1970s. It is a tidy enough history, but then Meet the Quagmires puts Peter and Lois and Quagmire all together at that same 1984 country club, already friends, already a group, with no Navy ship anywhere in the picture. Both cannot be the first meeting. Both are presented as if they were simply the way things happened. And the show makes no effort to choose, because each was written to serve the needs of its own episode, and the needs of the episode are the only master this history has ever really answered to. Try, as an exercise, to be the kind of viewer who keeps a careful timeline, and watch the whole structure come apart in your hands. You cannot fit the Navy meeting and the country club meeting into the same life as two first meetings, because there can only be one first. You cannot lay the teenage romance of 1984 neatly on top of the Towel Boy origin, because they describe different people meeting in different ways at different points. Every attempt to reconcile them forces you to throw out at least one episode's version as somehow not counting, and the show gives you no guidance about which one to discard, because as far as the show is concerned, none of them is the real one, and none of them is the fake one. They are all simply true, locally, for the length of the episode that needed them, and false everywhere else. And the show is perfectly at peace with that, even though a careful viewer cannot be. And underneath all of it waits the largest problem of all, the one we will open up properly in the next section. Standing at that 1984 country club, laughing along as a young man among other young people, is Quagmire. Elsewhere in the show, in a moment we will come to, there exists an official document, a driver's license, that puts Quagmire's birth decades earlier than that night could allow, making him a man already well into adulthood at a time when the country club story needs him to be young alongside Peter and Lois. The two facts cannot share a calendar. A man cannot be a fresh-faced youth at a club in 1984, and also, by his own paperwork, have been born long enough before that to make the youth impossible. The romance section and the age section, in other words, do not merely each contain contradictions. They contradict each other, which is a kind of contradiction one level up, the show disagreeing not just with its own past but with itself across two different subjects at once. It is striking, too, that the show is willing to do this to a marriage it otherwise treats as genuinely solid. Peter and Lois are not a couple on the rocks, written loosely because the show does not care about them. They are the stable center of the whole series, a marriage that survives every disaster the show throws at it. You might expect that a couple this central would have at least one fixed, agreed-upon story of how they began. Instead, they have several, and the show feels free to add another whenever a new episode wants one. The stability of the marriage and the instability of its origin sit side by side without any tension, because the show holds them in two different places. The marriage is a fact it uses constantly and treats as real. The origin of the marriage is just material available for rewriting. A thing can be both load-bearing and endlessly rewritten at the same time. On this show, because being used and being fixed are simply not the same thing here. It is worth noticing that the rewrite was driven by a parody, because that is so often where these contradictions come from on this show. Family Guy loves to borrow the shape of a famous movie and pour its own characters into it, and when it does, the characters bend to fit the borrowed shape rather than the shape bending to fit the characters. A time travel film needs a fixed first meeting, so the Griffins get a fixed first meeting, regardless of the one they already had. The movie of the week sets the terms, and the show's own history quietly reshapes itself to meet them. The established past is not a constraint the parody has to respect. It is just more clay, and the parody presses it into whatever form it needs. For most series, the first meeting of the central couple is close to sacred ground. It is the moment the whole show is secretly about, the thing everything else descends from, and writers tend to fix it early and guard it forever, because to change it is to change the foundation of the marriage the audience has invested in. Couples on long-running shows can have their meeting retold, lovingly, in flashback, but the facts of it usually stay put, because the facts are load-bearing. Family Guy treats that supposedly sacred moment as ordinary working material, no more protected than a job or a haircut, available to be rebuilt from scratch the instant a parody wants a different version. The foundation is not fixed, it is poured fresh fresh whenever a new episode needs the floor to be a slightly different shape. And so the same lesson that applied to a single person's history applies even more strikingly to a history shared by two. Joe's injury and Brian's age are facts that live inside one character, and the show rewrites them freely. The meeting of Peter and Lois is a fact that lives between two characters, the founding fact of the entire family, and the show rewrites that just as freely. If anything, it rewrites it more freely, because the romance keeps getting pulled into parodies and gimmicks that each demand their own version of it. The thing you would most expect a show to hold still, the love story at its center, turns out to be one of the things it holds least still of all. Here is what makes all of this worth dwelling on. A show will usually protect its central love story above almost everything else it has. The romance at the heart of a series is the thing the audience is meant to believe in, the emotional anchor that makes everyone care about all the rest. Most shows guard it carefully. Family Guy does not. Even the meeting of its two leads, the single founding event of the entire series, the moment without which there is no family and no show, is treated as just another variable, available to be rewritten the instant a parody or a punchline happens to want it rewritten. Nothing on this show is sacred, not even the beginning of the one marriage the entire thing is built on top of. And once you try to line those meetings up on a calendar, you run straight into a man whose own driver's license refuses to cooperate. Section 6. The ages that don't add up. Glenn Quagmire has a driver's license, and that license has a birth year printed on it, and that single printed number quietly breaks the entire show. The license turns up in an episode called Foxy Lady, the 10th episode of the 7th season, which aired on March 22, 2009. On it, Quagmire's year of birth is given as 1948. Do the simple arithmetic against the year the episode came out, and the number that falls out the other side is 61. Glenn Quagmire, the swinging, skirt-chasing neighbor who behaves in every single episode like a man in roughly the same stage of life as Peter, is, according to his own official paperwork, a man of 61. That number does not fit anything around it. Quagmire is presented week after week as Peter's contemporary and close friend, one of the men Peter drinks with at the bar, a peer in age and energy and outlook. We have already seen, in the episode about how Peter and Lois met, that Quagmire was at that country club back in 1984 as a young man, running around with Peter and Lois when they were 18. We have seen him, in another episode, recount a romantic escapade set in 1986 as something from his own younger years. None of that can be squared with a man born in 1948. A person born in 1948 was already well into his 30s in 1984, not a youth at a country club beside a pair of teenagers. The license and the flashbacks describe two completely different men who happen to share a name, a house, and a face. And the number does not even hold still once the show has set it down. In a later episode, Quagmire's parent, Ida, describes having gone through a particular major life change at the age of 61, and that lands at a point in the show well after Foxy Lady had already pinned the very same age, 61, onto Quagmire himself. So the number drifts around the family, attached first to one member and then echoed by another, never anchored to any real and consistent timeline. The show put a precise, specific, checkable figure on the screen, the kind of detail that on most programs signals a writer being careful, and then treated it with exactly as much respect as it treats everything else, which is to say with none at all the moment the joke was over. The explanation, of course, is that the number was only ever a joke. The license is a throwaway gag, a quick laugh about Quagmire being secretly far older than he looks, and the show has even supplied its own absurd, in-world reason for his youthful appearance, a running bit about him eating carrots to keep himself young. None of it was ever meant to bear weight. The writers needed a funny detail on a license for a single scene, reached for the idea that Quagmire is improbably old, printed 1948, collected their laugh, and moved on, with no intention whatsoever of letting that number constrain a single future episode. It is the rule of funny in its smallest and purest form, a specific fact, invented for one joke, flatly contradicting everything around it, and discarded the instant the scene ended. But Quagmire is only the loudest example of the show's trouble with age. The deeper, and frankly sadder, version of the same problem belongs to Meg. Meg Griffin is the oldest of the Griffin children, and she is a teenager, and she has been a teenager for the entire length of the show. This is the sliding timeline doing to her exactly what it does to Stewie, only stretched across the long, awkward years of adolescence instead of across infancy. And yet, even while she is frozen in her teens, Meg keeps having milestone birthdays, and the milestones do not agree with one another. In the same episode where Peter loses one father and gains another, there is a birthday for Meg, and the show plays a small, cruel little joke at her expense, built entirely on the fact that her own parents do not actually know how old she is. They bring out 16 candles, guessing, and Meg has to correct them, telling them she is 17. Her parents cannot keep their own daughter's age straight, which is funny and also quietly miserable, and the number for that episode lands at 17. Then, in a later episode built around Meg, she turns 18, crossing crossing over into adulthood, at least for the length of that one story. And around all of this, the relationship between Meg's age and her brother Chris's age drifts as well, the two of them sliding nearer to and further from each other across the seasons depending on what a given story happens to need them to be. There is something worth slowing down for here, because underneath the contradiction sits one of the very few genuinely melancholy notes in the whole show. Meg is the family's punching bag, the one they ignore and insult and forget, and the sliding timeline traps her in that role forever. She never ages out of the house. She never gets to grow up, move away, and become someone the family is forced to take seriously. She is held, permanently, at the exact age where she is most vulnerable to their cruelty, and the show keeps her there not out of malice but out of pure mechanics, because the machine simply does not let anyone move. The contradictions in Meg's birthdays are funny on the surface, the parents who cannot count, the age that keeps changing. But the thing those contradictions are about is a girl who is never allowed to escape, and there is a real, quiet sadness in that if you let yourself sit with it, a child held at the worst possible moment of her life, because the show she lives inside does not believe in the passage of time. What makes all of this especially striking is that age is, of everything a show has to keep track of, by far the easiest. You do not need a detailed memory to keep a character's age consistent. You only need to count. A year passes, a character grows a year older, and the arithmetic does the rest. It is the simplest form of continuity there is. And Family Guy cannot manage it not because the writers cannot count, but because the show has made two decisions that together make counting impossible. It has decided that no one will age, which freezes everyone in place, and it has decided that any specific number is fair game for a joke, which means ages get handed out and taken back purely for laughs. Put those two decisions side by side and you get exactly what the show has. A cast whose ages are at once frozen and constantly shifting. A baby who is always 1, a teenager who is 16 and 17 and 18, and a neighbor whose license says 61 while he lives the life of a man half that age. It is worth sitting for a moment with the fact that the contradiction is printed on a license of all things, because a license is a particular kind of object. In the real world, a driver's license is about as official as a personal fact gets. A document issued by the government, checked and trusted, the very thing you hand over when someone needs proof of who you are and how old you are. When the show chooses to put Quagmire's age on a license, it is reaching for the most authoritative possible source, the kind of detail that, on a show that cared, would settle the question for good. And then it ignores the document completely. If even a license, even an official printed record, cannot pin a character's age down, then nothing can, because the show does not recognize any source as binding. The most official fact in the world is just another joke once the laugh has been collected, and the trouble Quagmire's age causes does not stay contained to Quagmire. Because he is woven into so many of the show's flashbacks, his impossible age drags the whole shared history out of joint. If Quagmire was a young man at that country club in 1984, then the country club story assumes one set of ages for everyone standing there. If Quagmire was born in 1948, then he was decades older than the friends beside him, which means either he was a grown man among teenagers, or the entire scene is impossible. Every flashback that includes him inherits the contradiction. His age is not one isolated error sitting off to the side. It is a crack that runs through every shared memory the show has ever shown, because there is no way to place him correctly in any of them. Meg's trouble with age is gentler on the surface and harder underneath. Where Quagmire's contradiction is a loud printed number, Meg's is a slow, grinding wrongness that never quite resolves. The birthdays are only the most countable part of it. Across the show, Meg is treated as older and younger as the story requires. Sometimes a child to be ordered around, sometimes a young adult with adult problems, sometimes the butt of a joke that needs her to be exactly the age that makes the joke land. The specific milestone shifts from episode to episode, but the deeper instability is that the show has never actually decided what stage of life Meg is in, only that she must remain, broadly, a teenager forever. So she hovers, never quite a child, never quite an adult, her exact age reset to whatever each story finds useful, the one fixed rule being that she can never grow all the way up. And this is where Meg's contradiction stops being merely a continuity problem and becomes something with a little ache in it. Think about what it would mean for Meg if the clock ever did move. She would graduate. She would leave the house that treats her so badly. She would go somewhere her father's casual cruelty and her family's constant dismissal could not follow her, and she would get the one thing every teenager is promised, which is that adolescence ends. The sliding timeline takes that promise away from her. It holds her at the exact age where she is most mocked and least powerful, and it holds her there not for any reason inside the story, but simply because the show does not permit anyone to age. Of all the characters frozen by the timeline, Meg is the one for whom the freeze is quietly the cruelest, because she is the one who most needs time to pass, and time is the one thing the show will never give her. There is a grim symmetry between Meg and Stewie when you set them side by side. Stewie is frozen at the very beginning of childhood, a baby who never gets to take his first real steps toward being a boy. Meg is frozen at the end of childhood, a teenager who never gets to step out into being an adult. The show has pinned the two of them at the entrance and the exit of growing up, and locked both doors. For Stewie, the freeze protects a joke, the evil genius baby. For Meg, the freeze protects a role, the family punching bag. In both cases, a child is held in place so the comedy can keep working, and in both cases, the cost is paid by a character who is never allowed to become anything other than what the show first needed them to be. It would be easy enough, in theory, to fix any one of these. The show could simply pick an age for Quagmire and keep it. It could let Meg have one birthday and then count forward from there. None of that would be hard. The reason it never happens is not difficulty but design. To fix the ages, the show would have to let time pass, and letting time pass is the one thing the format forbids, because time passing would mean Stewie growing up, Meg leaving home, the parents aging, the whole cast drifting toward the natural endpoints that real-time forces on everyone. The show cannot allow that and remain the show it is, so it accepts permanent contradiction as the price of permanent youth, and it pays that price in every birthday it scrambles, and every license it quietly ignores. It is worth noticing that the show occasionally offers in-world excuses for these age problems, and that the excuses are themselves jokes rather than fixes. The running bit about Quagmire eating carrots to stay young is a perfect example, an absurd pseudo-explanation that does not actually resolve anything, but does turn the contradiction into one more gag. This is the show's habit everywhere, as we have seen, to meet a hole not with a patch but with a punchline, to wave at the problem in a way that gets a laugh while leaving the problem exactly where it was. An age that makes no sense is handed a silly reason, the silly reason gets a chuckle, and the nonsense remains, now wearing a joke as a hat. The show is not trying to make you believe the carrots work. It is trying to make you laugh at the idea, and a laugh, for this show, has always been a complete and sufficient answer to a contradiction. The arithmetic was never the point, and so the arithmetic is never checked, and a number that happened to be funny once is left sitting there, plainly wrong, forever after. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that age is simply not a quantity this show tracks. There is no master timeline in a drawer somewhere recording how old anyone is. No reference the writers consult before deciding a character's age in a given scene. Each age is invented fresh, for the needs of its own episode, the same way each backstory and each first meeting and each job is invented fresh. The result is a cast whose ages are not facts but suggestions, offered anew whenever a story requires one, never meant to add up across the whole, because the whole was never the unit the show was working in. The unit was always the episode, and an episode only needs an age to be true for the 20-odd minutes it lasts. The ages do not add up because the show was never trying to make them add up. It was trying to make them funny, and a funny number beats a consistent number every time the two of them collide. If this kind of long look at something you grew up with is what you come here for, subscribe. It's free, and it tells us these videos are worth making. And ages were not the only thing in Quahog that refused to sit still. A man's entire career could vanish between one Sunday and the next. Section 7. The jobs, the house, and the town that won't stay put. Peter Griffin has held a great many jobs over the life of the show, and the show treats his employment the way it treats nearly everything else, as something that exists for the length of an episode and then quietly disappears. For the early years, Peter had a steady job that the show actually committed to. He was a safety inspector at the happy-go-lucky toy factory, working under a boss named Mr. Weed, and that job was a fixed part of his life across the first several seasons. It gave him a workplace, a routine, a reason to leave the house. Then, in an episode from the third season, which aired in early September of 2001, Mr. Weed died, choking to death at a dinner, and with him, the toy factory storyline effectively ended. Peter's steady job was gone, written out along with the man who employed him. What followed was a series of replacements. For a stretch, Peter became a fisherman working a boat of his own, until that boat was destroyed and that career ended too. Eventually, he landed at the Pawtucket Brewery, the beer company that became his long-running workplace from an episode in the fourth season onward, and the brewery has served, more or less, as the job he resets to whenever the show needs him to have one. Around all of that sit dozens upon dozens of one-episode jobs, careers Peter picks up and discards within a single story, a new profession nearly every time the plot requires one, none of them lasting past the final scene, and the timeline of even his most established job does not hold together. One episode claims that Peter had worked at the toy factory since 1977. Set that against the show's own account of Peter as an 18-year-old at a country club in 1984, and the math falls apart immediately. If he started at the factory in 1977, he would have been a small child when he began, years before he was the teenager the show elsewhere shows him to be. The dates simply do not line up, because the dates were never meant to line up. Each was chosen to serve its own episode, and no one was keeping a master record of when Peter was born, how old he was, or when he started work. It is hard to overstate how many jobs Peter has actually held, because the show hands him a new one almost any time a story needs a setting. Over the years, he has been, alongside the brewery worker and and the fisherman, a stand-in for countless single-episode professions, picked up at the start of a story and dropped by the end. He becomes whatever the plot of the week requires, a man with a new career and a new uniform and a new set of co-workers, and then, by the next episode, none of it is ever mentioned again. The jobs do not build on one another. They leave him with no lasting skills, no contacts, no consequences. Each one exists in its own sealed episode, exactly like a cutaway gag stretched to the length of a full story, and the moment the story ends, the job evaporates and Peter returns to his default. Even the brewery, the closest thing Peter has to a stable career, is held loosely. It is where the show puts him when it needs him to have a normal working life, a reliable backdrop of co-workers and a boss and a place to go. But the show feels free to ignore it entirely whenever a story wants Peter somewhere else, and free to bend the details of the job to fit whatever a given episode needs. The brewery is less a real and consistent workplace than a home base, a place the show can return Peter to between adventures, useful precisely because it asks nothing and remembers nothing. It is the job equivalent of the reset button, always there, always the same, always ready to pretend the last dozen jobs never happened. There is a financial version of the same churn too, sitting just underneath the jobs. The Griffins are, in most episodes, an ordinary family of modest means, getting by on whatever Peter earns and worrying about bills. And yet Lois comes from staggering wealth, the daughter of one of the richest families around, which means the family is, at any moment the show wants it to be, one phone call away from a fortune. So the Griffins are poor when a story needs them poor, and suddenly flush when a story needs them rich, their entire financial situation expanding and contracting to fit the plot. Peter's revolving jobs are part of that picture, each one paying whatever the episode requires. The family's money rising and falling not according to any consistent economic logic, but according to what each story needs them to be able to afford. It is worth noticing why job churn in particular is so useful to a show like this. A new job is a new world. Each profession Peter steps into comes with its own setting, its own cast of co-workers, its own situations to mine for comedy. By keeping Peter's career loose, the show gives itself permission to drop him into any workplace it likes, a new one every week if it wants, an endless supply of fresh backdrops. If the show committed to a single job and kept him there, it would lose all of that. So it treats his employment as disposable on purpose, not because it cannot keep track, but because keeping him movable is worth far more to the comedy than keeping him consistent. The churn is not a failure of memory. It is a refusal to be tied down, applied to a man's entire working life. None of the people attached to these jobs persist either. Peter has had bosses and co-workers by the dozen, figures who loom large in a single episode and are then never seen or mentioned again, as disposable as the jobs that contain them. A workplace full of named characters one week is empty the next, its inhabitants quietly retired along with the setting. It is the same vanishing we are about to watch happen to other characters, but it happens to Peter's work life constantly and almost invisibly, an endless parade of colleagues who exist only for as long as the job that employed them, and who disappear the moment the show moves Peter somewhere new. The instability is not limited to Peter's jobs. It reaches the very house the family lives in. The Griffin home is almost always given the address of 31 Spooner Street, a number repeated often enough that fans know it by heart. But in an early first season episode, a letter Peter sends out carries the return address 725 Spooner Street, a different house number entirely, for the same home. And the house itself does not keep a stable shape. The number of windows on the front changes between episodes. The interior layout, the position of rooms, the arrangement of the staircase, all shift from one story to the next depending on what a given scene needs. The same is true of other houses in the neighborhood, which expand, contract, and rearrange themselves as the show requires. The inside of the house drifts as much as the outside. Furniture moves and changes. The contents of rooms shift to suit a scene. The children's bedrooms, the kitchen, the living room where so much of the show takes place, all of them rearrange their details from episode to episode, a picture here one week and gone the next, a layout that never quite settles. On most family shows, the home is the single most carefully maintained space, the fixed and familiar set the audience comes back to like a second home of their own, every corner of it known and consistent. The Griffin house never achieves that kind of solidity, because the show never asks it to. It is drawn freshly each time, close enough to recognize, never identical, a home that exists more as a general idea than as a specific, mappable place. What is striking is how little this matters to the experience of watching, which is itself part of the point. You can watch hundreds of episodes set largely in this one house and never once be bothered by the fact that its layout will not hold still, because the show never draws your attention to the inconsistency and never depends on the geography being fixed. The home works as a setting precisely because the show treats it loosely, free to put a room wherever a scene needs it, free to add or remove a feature for a single joke. A more rigid house would actually get in the way, forcing scenes to obey a fixed floor plan. By keeping the house fluid, the show keeps it useful, the same trade it makes everywhere. Flexibility bought at the price of consistency, and the price, as always, is one the show is glad to pay. Notice too that for all the drift in the details, the family never actually moves. They have lived in the same house on the same street for the entire run of the show, never relocating, never upgrading, never downsizing, despite Peter's wildly swinging fortunes and endless changes of career. A family whose income lurches from broke to wealthy and back, who gains and loses jobs by the dozen, would in any realistic world move house more than once. The Griffins never do. The house drifts in its details and stays fixed in its existence, always the same home even as its windows multiply and its rooms wander, because the show needs a stable home base even more than it needs a consistent one. The address can wobble and the layout can shuffle, but the house itself must remain, the one fixed point the show returns to no matter where a story has taken everyone. It is worth stepping back to see how completely the setting mirrors the characters. The people on this show have unstable pasts, unstable ages, unstable relationships, all kept loose, so the comedy can do anything with them. The place they live is exactly the same: an unstable job, an unstable house, an unstable town, all of it kept loose for exactly the same reason. There is a real consistency in the inconsistency, once you notice it. The show is not haphazardly sloppy about some things and careful about others. It is uniformly, deliberately loose about everything that could otherwise constrain a joke, and a setting is just one more thing that could constrain a joke. So the setting drifts, right along with the people, both of them held in the same permanent, useful state of almost but not quite the same. It is worth pausing to note that this last kind of contradiction is slightly different from the others we have looked at tonight. When the show rewrites who Peter's father is, that is a story choice, a deliberate decision to change the past for a joke or a plot. When the windows on the house change number, that is something else. The ordinary inconsistency of animation produced quickly, over many years, by many different hands. It is less a rewrite than a kind of drift, the natural result of a show that has drawn its own world thousands of times without ever holding a single blueprint in front of it. The geography of the show's home state bends the same way, distances and locations shifting to suit the needs of a story rather than any fixed map. It is worth naming the difference because not every plot hole is a decision. Some are simply what happens when a world is built over and over from memory rather than from a plan. It is worth a final comparison with the shows this one grew up alongside. The classic family sitcom tends to treat its central job and its central home as anchors, fixed points the audience can rely on, the workplace and the living room as stable as the characters themselves. Part of the comfort of those shows is exactly that stability, the sense of returning each week to a place that is reliably itself. This show offers a different kind of comfort, the comfort of a place that will reliably surprise you, where the job might be anything and the house might be laid out anyway, and the family might be rich or broke depending on the week. It trades the reassurance of a stable world for the freedom of an unstable one, and its audience, by and large, has happily made that trade, because what the show loses in solidity, it more than makes back in the sheer range of what it is then free to do. There is even a question of when exactly all of this is happening, and the show has no fixed answer to that either. Because the timeline slides, the present moment of the show is always simply now, whatever now happens to be in the year a given episode airs. So Peter's jobs, the house, the town, all of it floats in an ever-moving present, never anchored to a particular year, which is part of why the dates that do get mentioned, like the claim about working somewhere since a specific year in the past, cause such trouble. A fixed date is a stake driven into ground that is supposed to keep moving, and the moment the show drives one in, it contradicts the floating present everything else lives in. The setting is unstuck in time the same way the characters are unstuck in age, and for the same reason, because the show needs to stay free to be set whenever the next story wants it set. But whether the change is a deliberate rewrite or an accidental drift, the effect on the viewer is the same. Nothing in Quahog stays where you left it. The job Peter had last season is gone this season. The house has a different number of windows than it did 2 episodes ago. The address on the door is one thing in the pilot and another thing forever after. The town is less a real and stable place than a stage set struck and rebuilt and redressed each week, close enough to the same to be recognizable, never quite the same in its details. And a town that will not keep its own street addresses straight is not going to keep anything else straight either. And if a job could disappear without a trace, so, it turned out, could a person. Section 8. The people who disappeared. There is a name, borrowed from an older television show, for what happens when a character simply vanishes from a series with no explanation, as if they had never existed. It is called Chuck Cunningham syndrome, and Family Guy has a serious case of it. The name comes from a show called Happy Days, a hugely popular series from the 1970s about a family and their friends. That family had an older son named Chuck, who appeared in the early going, and then, over time, simply stopped appearing. He was never written out, never explained, never sent away on any stated errand. He went upstairs one day, in effect, and never came back down, and the show carried on as though the family had always had one fewer child. The disappearance was so clean and so total that his name became the label for the whole phenomenon. The character who quietly evaporates while everyone left behind acts as if nothing is missing. Family Guy does this repeatedly. The clearest example is Kevin Swanson, the son of Joe and Bonnie, the neighbors across the street. Kevin appeared in the early seasons as a normal part of the Swanson household, and then he disappeared, dropping out of the show for a long stretch. At one point, the show even reached for a dark little joke to explain the absence, suggesting that Kevin had died serving in Iraq. And then, later, with no real fuss, Kevin simply turned up again, alive, sitting at the family table for a holiday, as though nothing had ever happened to him. He vanished, was casually written off, and then reappeared, his supposed death quietly forgotten the moment the show wanted him back. He is not alone. Brian's cousin, a dog named Jasper, appeared in several episodes and then largely faded out of the show. A baby born to one of Quagmire's romantic partners, in an early episode about an unplanned pregnancy, is never meaningfully seen again. A whole infant introduced and then dropped. There are references, here and there, to other children and relatives who appear once and then evaporate. The pattern is consistent. The show introduces people, uses them when they are useful, and lets them disappear when they are not, with no obligation to account for where they went. And then, in a remarkable moment, the show names its own habit directly. In an episode from the 4th season, which aired in December of 2005, Peter invokes what he calls the sacred mystery of Chuck Cunningham, referring openly to that very Happy Days character who went upstairs and never returned. The show, in other words, knows exactly what it does. It knows that characters vanish from series without explanation, it knows the name for it, and it makes a joke out of the knowledge, all while being one of the worst offenders the trope has ever produced. It is the single clearest confession in the entire show. A program pausing to point at the precise thing it does constantly, and to treat that thing as a shared joke with the audience, rather than a problem to be fixed. The flip side of characters who vanish without dying is characters who die without staying dead, and here too the show keeps its own strange rules. Peter, as we have seen, has died more than once with no lasting consequence at all, because the show needs its lead and the show does not regard his death as binding. But other characters do die permanently, and the line between who stays dead and who does not is often drawn not by the story, but by events in the real world. When a beloved newscaster character is killed in a murder mystery episode in the 9th season, that death sticks. When the actor who voiced the eccentric Mayor Adam West passed away in real life in 2017, the show wrote the character out in turn, acknowledging his death rather than recasting him. A character on the spin-off connected to this world was killed off as well. The pattern, taken together, is that death on this show is permanent only when the show decides it should be, and very often that decision is shaped by whether a real person behind a voice is still there to perform it. This is worth handling plainly because some of these deaths reach out of the cartoon and touch real loss. When a voice actor dies and a character is retired in response, the inconsistency, a world where some deaths are forever and others are undone by the next episode, stops being purely a matter of comedy and becomes something more careful and more human. The show is not being careless in those moments. It is doing the opposite, letting a real death matter inside a world that otherwise refuses to let death matter at all. It is worth being plain about the Kevin Swanson example because it sits at an uncomfortable intersection of comedy and something heavier. The line used to explain his absence, that he had died in the war, is the kind of dark joke the show reaches for often, and then the show simply undoes it, bringing Kevin back alive with no acknowledgement that it had ever said otherwise. Setting aside the grimness of the joke itself, what it shows is how little weight the show gives even to a character's death. Kevin was written off with a single grim line, and written back in with none, his supposed death treated as so unimportant that it did not even need to be addressed when he returned. A death that can be applied and then quietly cancelled was never really a death at all. It was a placeholder, used to explain an absence, and discarded the moment the absence ended. And the list of the vanished is longer than any single example. There are children who appear and are forgotten, relatives who turn up once and never again, neighbors and classmates and co-workers who populate a single episode and then are quietly removed from the world. Some of them are gone because the show simply lost interest. Some are gone because a storyline ended and took them along with it. But the effect is always the same, a steady, low-level disappearance of people from the show's world, a cast that is constantly shedding members without ceremony. If you tried to assemble a complete and accurate roster of everyone ever established as part of these characters' lives, you would find that a great many of them have simply evaporated, present once and absent forever after, with the show carrying on as though they had never been there. What makes the Chuck Cunningham moment so striking is the level of self-awareness it reveals. To make that joke, the writers had to know the trope by name. They had to know that characters vanish from shows without explanation, that there is a recognized term for it, that the most famous example is the very Happy Days character they are referencing. In other words, the people making the show are completely aware of the phenomenon, aware enough to joke about it knowingly, and they commit it anyway, constantly. That is not ignorance. It is a choice made with full knowledge. edge. The show knows that its characters disappear, knows that this is a known weakness of long-running series, and has decided the weakness is funny rather than worth fixing. It would rather make a clever joke about vanishing characters than actually keep track of its own. The question of who stays dead deserves a closer look too, because the line the show draws is so revealing. Inside the fiction, death is almost meaningless. Characters are killed and restored, threatened and spared, with no consistent rules, the whole question bending to whatever a story needs. But step outside the fiction to the real world, and a different and far more consistent rule appears. When a performer who gave a character their voice passes away, the show tends to let that character go too, retiring them rather than handing the role to someone new. The death the show honors most reliably is not any death inside the story, it is the death of the real person behind the voice. That is a striking thing to notice, that the most binding form of mortality on this cartoon comes not from its own plots, but from the world outside it. There is a useful contrast hiding in all of this, with how a more continuity-minded show would handle the same situations. On a series that cared about its world, a character could not simply vanish. Their absence would be noticed, explained, written into the story. A death would carry weight and consequences that rippled forward. A return would be an event, accounted for and earned. Those shows spend real effort tracking who is present and who is gone, because the integrity of their world depends on it. Family Guy spends none of that effort, and not because the effort is beyond the writers. It is because the show has decided that the integrity of its world is simply not worth the cost. A character is useful or not useful, on-screen or off-screen, and the bookkeeping of who is where and why is exactly the kind of memory the show declined to keep. There is a rough hierarchy hiding in who gets to vanish and who does not, and it tells you what the show actually values. The core family, Peter, Lois, the children, the dog, never disappear because the show is built around them and cannot proceed without them. The next ring out, the close friends and neighbors, are mostly safe, kept around because the show relies on them, though even they can leave and return. But the further you get from the center, the more disposable a character becomes, until you reach the outermost ring, the one-episode figures and minor relations, who can be introduced and discarded freely, present for exactly as long as they are useful, and gone the instant they are not. Survival on this show is a function of usefulness. The more a character matters to the machine, the more permanent they are, and the less they matter, the more easily they evaporate. What is most telling is that absence, on this show, requires no explanation at all. In a story that took its world seriously, a character's disappearance would demand an account. Where did they go? Why did no one notice? The missing person would be a mystery the story owed its audience an answer to. Family Guy reverses that burden entirely. A character can simply stop appearing, and the show feels no obligation to say why, because the show does not regard a character's continued existence as a promise it made. People are present when the show wants them and absent when it does not, and the absence is not a loose end to be tied off, but simply the default state of anyone the show is not currently using. Nobody has to be written out, because nobody was ever guaranteed to stay in. And nobody mourns the vanished, which is its own quiet tell. When a character disappears from this show, the characters who remain do not notice, do not grieve, do not so much as remark on the empty chair. A son can be gone for years, and the family carries on as though they had always been one fewer. A friend can drop out of the group and the group reassembles around the gap without comment. That absence of mourning is not coldness on the character's part. It is the show declining to treat the disappearance as an event at all, because to mourn someone is to remember them, and remembering is the one thing this show will not do. The vanished are not lost. They are simply switched off, and you do not grieve an appliance you have unplugged. There is a final irony worth naming. This show, which forgets its own people so readily, has a long memory for its own jokes. Running gags persist for years. Callbacks reach back across many seasons. The show clearly can remember, when remembering serves the comedy, and it does so eagerly, rewarding longtime viewers who catch a reference to something from long ago. What it will not remember is anything that would constrain it, and a character's continued existence is exactly that kind of constraint. So the show keeps the jokes it wants to keep, and drops the people it no longer needs, remembering and forgetting, not at random, but along a single clear line, which is whether the thing in question helps the comedy or limits it. It is not that the show cannot remember. It is that it only remembers what is fun, and a missing character is rarely as fun as a good running joke. Occasionally, the show even lampshades a character's return, the way it lampshades everything else, having someone note out loud that the returning figure had been gone, or joking about how little sense their reappearance makes. It is the same reflex we keep seeing, the show pointing at its own seam rather than smoothing it. A character drops out for a long stretch, comes back, and instead of pretending the absence never happened, the show winks at it, turning the gap itself into a quick joke. This is the difference between an old-fashioned vanishing, where a character simply evaporates and is never mentioned again, and the show's more self-aware mode, where the vanishing and the return are both acknowledged and both played for comedy. Either way, the underlying carelessness about who is present is the same. same. The only thing that changes is whether the show keeps the carelessness quiet or makes a joke out of it, and more over the years it has chosen the joke. But the underlying logic, set gently to one side of those real losses, is the same logic we have been tracing all night. Presence and absence on this show are not fixed facts about a character, they are settings. A person can be a regular part of the family one season and gone the next, with no explanation, and then back again with no explanation, and the show feels no need to reconcile any of it. The family portrait is redrawn constantly, people added and quietly erased, and the show trusts, correctly, that most viewers will not stop to count who is missing. If this kind of long look at something you grew up with is what you come here for, subscribe. It's free, and it tells us these videos are worth making. Some characters vanished and were never explained. Others did the opposite. They left in full view, with a send-off and a goodbye, and then came back as if the leaving had never happened. Section 9. The ones who left came back or were erased. If the last section was about characters who slipped quietly out of existence, this one is about the opposite. Characters who left loudly, with full goodbyes, and then returned as though the goodbye had never been said. And the clearest case is Cleveland Brown. Cleveland was one of Peter's closest friends. From the very beginning, a calm, soft-spoken neighbor and a fixture of the bar where the men gathered. Then the show sent him away, on purpose, and with fanfare, to headline his own separate program. He packed up, left Quahog, and moved away to begin a new life elsewhere, and for a stretch of years he was simply gone from Family Guy, off living in another show entirely. And then he came back. In an episode from the 12th season, which aired in May of 2014, Cleveland returns to Quahog and slots right back into his old life, his old seat at the bar, his old friendships, as if the long departure had been little more than a trip out of town. What makes the return so characteristic of the show is how openly it jokes about itself. When Cleveland comes back, the other characters do not pretend nothing happened. They mock the very idea of his time away, needling him about the separate show he had gone off to, while Cleveland defends that show, at one point praising it for the very thing Family Guy itself so rarely bothers with: continuity. It is a strange and funny little hall of mirrors. A character on a show with almost no continuity, defending a different show for having some. Inside an episode whose whole job is to undo a departure and pretend it barely mattered. Cleveland carries a smaller contradiction too, attached to one of his most recognizable traits: his slow, deliberate way of speaking. In one episode, the show offers an origin for that slow speech, a flashback in which a heavy object falls on him and changes the way he talks. But that origin sits awkwardly against other episodes, including ones from before, in which Cleveland already speaks slowly, with no such event ever having happened. So even his manner of speaking has a cause in one story and no cause in another. An origin invented for a single flashback and contradicted by the rest of his appearances. But the strangest departure and return in the entire show does not belong to Cleveland. It belongs to a dog named Vinny, and it involves the show erasing a whole stretch of its own history. For a period, the Griffin household took in a new dog, Vinny, a warm, streetwise character voiced by an actor well known for playing a certain kind of tough guy role. Vinny was not a brief guest. He was folded fully into the family. He became part of the household, part of the stories, and the show even updated its famous opening credits to feature him in the spot once held by Brian. By every visible measure, Vinny was a member of the family, established and present and real. And then the show erased him. Through a plot device that reset the timeline, the entire stretch of the show in which Vinny lived with the family was declared never to have happened. Not ended, not concluded, but unmade, wiped out of the show's history, as though those episodes had been a path not taken. Vinny's whole tenure with the Griffins was retroactively deleted. The episodes still exist, of course. You can still watch them. But within the show's own logic, they no longer count, having been folded into a timeline that supposedly never occurred. Except the erasure did not quite hold, which is the most Family Guy detail of all. After Vinny had been written out of existence, after his time with the family had been declared unreal, he turned up again, in a later episode, in a small appearance. A character who had been formally erased from the show's history simply reappeared, a loose thread left dangling from a timeline that was supposed to have been cut away entirely. Even the show's act of erasing a character turned out not to be permanent, because nothing on this show is permanent, not even deletion. The same refusal to let time settle shows up in a quieter form with Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife. For an extraordinarily long stretch of the show, something like 6 seasons, Bonnie was visibly pregnant, carrying the same pregnancy year after year without ever giving birth, the sliding timeline freezing her in that state the way it freezes everyone else. When she finally did give birth to a daughter named Susie, in an episode in the 7th season, the show treated the event as a kind of absurd joke about how long it had taken, fully aware that it had kept this woman pregnant for years of real time. The pregnancy that would not end became, like so much else, a running gag built on the show's own refusal to let its clock advance. It is worth pausing to sort out the different ways a character can leave this show, because Cleveland and Vinny actually represent two distinct kinds signs of departure, and the show reverses both. Cleveland left in the ordinary way, written out of the story while remaining, in principle, a real part of its history. His time away happened. It simply happened elsewhere. Vinny's case is stranger because Vinny was not written out so much as written off, his entire existence with the family declared unreal after the fact. One is a character leaving the stage. The other is a character being removed from the record of who was ever on the stage at all. And the show, true to form, treated neither as final, bringing the departed friend back and letting the erased dog resurface, refusing to let either kind of exit actually stick. There is a logic to all this reversibility, the same logic that runs underneath everything else we have looked at. A show that never lets a departure be permanent is a show that never loses access to anyone. Cleveland can come back because the show never truly let him go. Vinny can reappear because erasure on this show is just one more reversible event. By refusing to make any exit final, the show keeps its entire cast permanently available, ready to be pulled back into the story whenever a future episode finds them useful. A more disciplined show pays a real price for its permanence, because a character it kills or sends away for good is a character it cannot use again. Family Guy never pays that price, because it never commits to any exit, which means its toy box is always full, every character it has ever had still within reach. The detail of the opening credits is worth lingering on, because of what it usually signifies. A show's opening sequence is its most stable element, the fixed ritual that plays at the start of every episode, the place reserved for the characters who truly belong. To put Vinny there was to declare him permanent, a member of the core family in the most official visual language the show has, and then to remove him again and restore the original is to treat even that most permanent of spots as provisional. If the opening credits, the one part of a show that is supposed never to change, can be rewritten and then rewritten back, then the show is telling you that permanence itself is not a category it recognizes. There is no place so fixed that the show will not edit it when a story requires. The cumulative effect of all this on a viewer is subtle but real. After enough reversals, you stop believing the show's goodbyes. When a character leaves, you do not quite accept that they are gone, because you have learned that gone is rarely permanent here. When a character dies, you hold the death loosely, because deaths on this show are so often undone. The show has trained its audience not to invest too heavily in any ending, because it has reversed too many of them. That is a strange thing to do to your viewers, to teach them not to trust the finality of your own storytelling, and the show does it not by accident, but as a direct consequence of valuing flexibility over consequence at every turn. Stakes require permanence, and a show that refuses permanence is a show that has quietly given up on stakes. Bonnie's long pregnancy is a slightly different creature from the departures and returns, and it is worth distinguishing. Cleveland and Vinny are about the reversibility of large events, leaving and erasure undone. Bonnie is about the freezing of a process that is supposed to move. A pregnancy is, by its nature, a thing that progresses toward an end, and the sliding timeline simply would not let it. So Bonnie hung suspended, expecting for years the most forward-moving condition a person can be in, held perfectly still by a show that does not allow forward motion. When the birth finally came, it was played as a joke about the wait, precisely because everyone, the show included, knew how absurd the delay had been. It is the timeline contradiction we saw with Stewie and Meg, applied to a pregnancy, with the same result, a natural progression frozen in place because the machine does not permit anyone or anything to advance. There is a kind of show famous for bringing the dead back to life, the daytime soap opera, where characters return from certain death with improbable regularity, revealed to have survived, or to have had a secret twin, or to have been somewhere else all along. Family Guy resurrects and reverses just as freely, but the reason could not be more different. Soaps undo their deaths to keep the drama going, because a beloved character is too valuable to lose and the audience aches for their return. Family Guy undoes its departures because it never invested in them as drama in the first place. The soap brings a character back because the loss mattered too much. This show brings a character back because the loss never mattered at all. The mechanism looks similar, a reversal of something that seemed final, but underneath, one is driven by caring too much and the other by caring too little. It is worth remembering that the largest of these reversals, Cleveland's, was driven by events entirely outside the story, which is itself part of the pattern. Cleveland left because the people making the show decided to build him a series of his own, and he returned because that series eventually ended. The in-world story, the send-off and the homecoming, was really just the show accommodating decisions made in the real world about what to produce. This is the same thing we saw with the deaths tied to real performers passing away, the show's own continuity bending to fit external realities. The fiction is not really in charge of itself. It rearranges to suit business decisions and real-world events, and then dresses those rearrangements up as story, which is one more way the show's internal history turns out to be answerable to almost everything except its own internal logic. And it is important to see that none of this is the same as a planned arc. When a well-built show sends a character away and brings them back, the leaving and the returning are usually usually part of a design, two halves of an intended story with meaning in the journey between them. Family Guy's reversals are not like that. The departures are real at the time, presented as endings, and the returns are not the completion of a plan, but simply the show changing its mind, bringing back what it had let go because it turned out to want it again. There is no arc connecting the two, no intended shape, just a thing that left and a later decision to have it return. The difference matters, because a planned return means something and an unplanned one means very little, and the show's returns, for all their fanfare, tend to mean very little, because they were never going anywhere in the first place. Taken all together, the lesson of these characters is that on this show there is no such thing as a final state. Gone is temporary. Dead is often temporary. Even erased, the most final-sounding condition imaginable, turns out to be temporary. The only truly permanent thing is the show's freedom to change its mind, to reach back and undo any departure, any death, any deletion, the moment a new episode wants what it had thrown away. That freedom is the whole engine, the same engine we have been watching all night, here applied to the largest events the show can stage. Nothing is ever really over, because the show reserves the right to reopen anything, and a show that can reopen anything has, in the end, closed nothing at all. It is fair to ask what the word canon could even mean on a show like this. On most series, canon is the body of established fact, the official record of what really happened, the thing fans appeal to when they argue about the story. It only works as a concept if the show treats its own past as binding, as a record that constrains what can come next. Family Guy does not treat its past that way, which makes its canon a strange and slippery thing, less a fixed record than a loose pile of episodes, each true in itself, many of them contradicting the others, none of them finally authoritative over the rest. When the show erases a character and then unerases him, when it kills someone who later turns up fine, it is not really violating its canon so much as revealing that it never had one in the binding sense. There is no official version of events to violate, only the latest version, which will itself be overwritten the moment a new episode wants something different. Put these together, Cleveland's leaving and returning, Vinny's erasure and reappearance, Bonnie's endless pregnancy, and you see the show treating even the largest, most final-seeming events as fully reversible. A character can leave for good and come back. A character can be erased from history and show up anyway. A pregnancy can last 6 years and then resolve in a joke. There is no exit that cannot be undone, no deletion that has to stay, no state that the show is obligated to honor once a new episode wants something different. By now, the show had rewritten parents, ages, jobs, deaths, and entire departures. There was really only one thing left for it to do with its own contradictions. Admit them out loud. Section 10, the show that knows there is one more thing the show was willing to rewrite, and it is the largest target of all. Not a person this time, but the town itself, all the way back to its founding. In an episode from the 4th season, which aired in May of 2006, the show presents an elaborate history of the Griffin family, and tucked inside it is a new origin for Quahog itself. An ancestor of Peter's, a man named Griffin Peterson, is shown being exiled from England by a petty king, Stuart III, and sailing to America, where he founds the town that will eventually become Quahog. It is a complete founding myth, and it revises and overwrites the bits and pieces the show had previously suggested about where the town came from. Even the origin of the place everyone lives, the single oldest fact a fictional town can have, was not safe from the show's willingness to reach back and rewrite. If the founding of the town can be changed for the sake of a family history episode, then truly nothing was ever fixed. And in the show's more recent years, something has shifted in how it handles these rewrites, something that brings this whole story to its point. The show has started doing the contradictions on purpose and out loud. Consider a recent example. In a late season episode, the show establishes that Peter has a uselessly weak throwing arm, so weak that it becomes the engine of the story, complete with an absurd explanation that he was taught to throw by raccoons. The problem is that this flatly contradicts earlier episodes, including one in which Peter is athletic enough to attend a fantasy camp for a Major League Baseball team, throwing and playing without trouble. A weak arm and a baseball fantasy camp cannot both be true of the same man. On the old show, this would simply have been one more quiet contradiction, slipped in and left for fans to notice on their own. But the recent show does something different. It has another character, Joe, point directly at the contradiction, naming the earlier episodes out loud, calling attention to the very inconsistency the episode is creating. That small change tells you how the show now understands itself. For years, the contradictions were a byproduct, the natural exhaust of the machine, there for anyone who cared to look but never pointed at directly. Now the show points at them. It creates a contradiction, and then, in the same breath, has a character announce it, treating the inconsistency not as a secret to be kept, but as a joke to be shared. The show has become fully aware of what it is, a program that rewrites its own past without hesitation, and it has decided that this awareness is itself a source of comedy. It no longer hides the seams, it frames them. It is worth appreciating the scale of that founding rewrite, because of what it overwrites. A town's origin is the deepest fact in its history, story, the bedrock beneath every other story set there. The show had, in scattered earlier moments, gestured at where Quahog came from, and then in this one family history episode it simply paved over all of that with a grand new myth, an exiled ancestor, a petty king, and a voyage to a new world. The new founding is not offered as one possibility among several. It is presented as the history, delivered with the confidence of established fact, exactly as the Towel Boy origin and the Grinch story and the Francis relationship were once presented as established fact. And like all of those, it is established only until the show decides otherwise. Even bedrock on this show turns out to be just another layer that can be repainted. The shift in how the show handles its contradictions, from hiding them to pointing at them, is the real story of its later years, and it deserves to be understood clearly. In the early seasons, the contradictions were mostly quiet. They were there, as we have seen, in abundance, but they were not advertised. A flashback would contradict an earlier flashback, and the show would simply move on, leaving the inconsistency for attentive viewers to catch on their own. The show was creating plot holes constantly, but it was not yet making the plot holes themselves into jokes. That changed. Somewhere along the way, the show grew fully self-conscious about its own reputation for contradiction, and began to treat that reputation as material. Now, when it creates a contradiction, it often stops to point at it, to have a character name the earlier episode being contradicted, to turn the inconsistency into the punchline, rather than leaving it as a quiet flaw. That move tells you something final about the show's relationship with continuity. A program that pauses to joke about contradicting itself has stopped even pretending to care about consistency, and has decided that the not caring is itself funny. It is one thing to be inconsistent because you are not paying attention. It is another thing entirely to be inconsistent on purpose, loudly, and to invite the audience to laugh at the inconsistency with you. The later show does the second thing. It has made peace with being a show full of holes, and more than peace, it has found a way to mine the holes for comedy, pointing at the very gaps it is creating, and treating them as part of the act. The plot holes have gone from being a byproduct the show ignored, to being a feature the show performs, and there is a connection between that self-aware shrug and the sheer length of the show's run, which is worth drawing out before we close. A show that takes its own continuity seriously is a show that gets harder to write over time, because the longer it runs, the more past it accumulates, the more facts it has to honor, the more corners it can paint itself into. Every established fact is a small constraint, and constraints pile up. A show that refuses to honor its own past never accumulates those constraints. It stays, in a sense, permanently young, permanently free, no harder to write in its 20th year than in its first, because it carries none of the weight that a faithful continuity would impose. The contradictions we have cataloged all night are the visible cost of that freedom, and the freedom, in turn, is a large part of why the show is still here, still producing, long after most series of its era have ended. It is tempting, looking at all of this, to want to scold the show, to treat the contradictions as a failure of craft that a more careful program would have avoided, but that misunderstands what the show is. A more careful program would also be a different program, slower, more bound, less able to do the wild and disconnected things that are the whole reason this show exists. The contradictions are not a flaw bolted onto an otherwise careful series. They are the inevitable shadow of the things the show does well. The cutaways, the parodies, the willingness to chase any joke anywhere it leads. You cannot have the one without the other. The freedom that produces the best gags is the same freedom that produces the worst contradictions, and the show decided, long ago, that the trade was worth making. Watching the plot holes pile up is, in a sense, just watching the bill come due for everything the show is willing to do for a laugh. There is one more layer to the show's late-period self-awareness, and it involves the audience. Over the show's long life, its contradictions did not go unnoticed. Fans cataloged them, argued about them, made long lists of every place the show contradicted itself, exactly the kind of list this very tour has been. The show is aware of that scrutiny. Its move toward pointing at its own plot holes, having a character name the episode being contradicted, is in part a response to a viewership that was already keeping score. The show looked at the fans counting its mistakes and decided to count along with them, out loud, turning the audience's own bookkeeping into a shared joke. It is a strange and clever bit of judo, taking the very thing critics use against a show, its inconsistency, and folding it into the comedy so completely that the inconsistency becomes something to enjoy rather than something to complain about. The throwing arm example repays one more look because of how brazen it is. The show does not quietly hope you have forgotten the earlier episodes where Peter played ball without trouble. It actively reminds you of them, naming them, daring you to notice the contradiction it is in the very act of creating. That is a long way from where the show started, where contradictions slipped by unannounced. It is the behavior of a show completely at ease with its own brokenness, so comfortable with rewriting itself that it will rewrite a fact and simultaneously point at the rewrite, confident that the audience is in on the joke. The contradiction is no longer something the show gets away with. It is something the show performs, deliberately, for the laugh that the contradiction itself provides. It is worth saying plainly that this approach has, by any commercial measure, worked. The show has run for more than 2 decades, an extraordinary span, outlasting countless series that guarded their continuity far more carefully. Whatever the contradictions cost the show in the eyes of a careful viewer, they clearly did not cost it survival, and may even have aided it. There is no court of canon that fines a show for inconsistency, no penalty for forgetting your own past beyond the mild irritation of the few who notice. And against that small cost sits a very large benefit: the endless freedom to keep making episodes without ever running out of room. The show made a wager, decades ago, that the freedom was worth more than the consistency, and the sheer length of its run is the wager paying off. What unites the founding rewrite and the self-aware throwing arm gag, separated as they are by many years, is that both treat the show's own history as raw material rather than as a record. The early show reached back and rewrote the deepest fact it had, the origin of the town itself, and the late show reaches back and rewrites a smaller fact while openly pointing at the rewrite, but the underlying freedom is identical. In neither case is the past treated as something owed respect. It is treated as clay, available to be reshaped whenever a new story wants a different shape. The only real change over the years being that the show has grown louder and prouder about the reshaping. The instinct was there from the very beginning. The late show simply stopped hiding it. It is the same hand at work in both, reaching into the past without hesitation, grown only more comfortable, season by season, with exactly what it is doing. So let us go back, one last time, to the 3 things we started with, because everything we have walked through tonight comes from them. The first was a style of comedy that does not have to remember itself. The cutaway, the joke sealed off from every other joke. That is where the small, scattered contradictions come from. The head with 2 origins, the past that changes from one gag to the next, the facts that are each true for a few seconds and false everywhere else. The second was a clock that runs for the world but not for the people, the sliding timeline. That is where the age contradictions come from. The baby frozen at 1, the teenager with 3 different birthdays, the neighbor whose license cannot possibly be right, the pregnancy that lasts 6 years. None of it adds up because the show froze the people while letting the calendar move around them. And the third was a writer's room that treats its own canon as a joke, the rule of funny carried to its limit. That is where the big rewrites come from. The swapped fathers, the retconned injury, the rewritten first meeting, the erased dog, the refounded town. Each of them is a place where the show looked at a fact it had already established and decided that a fresher joke was worth more than that fact, and made the trade without a second thought. Every plot hole we have looked at tonight grows out of one of those 3 things, and once you see that, the contradictions stop looking like failures. They are not the wreckage of a show that lost track of itself. They are the exhaust of a show that decided, on purpose and at the very start, that keeping track was never the point. The point was the joke, always the joke, and the show was willing to sacrifice anything to it, including its own memory of who these people are. There is even a strange kind of strength in that, which is worth saying plainly at the end. A show with no memory can never paint itself into a corner. It never has to write around a fact it regrets, never has to honor a choice that has stopped being useful, never runs out of room because it never let the room fill up in the first place. The same refusal to remember that produces all these contradictions is also part of what has let the show run for more than 2 decades, reinventing its characters again and again. Always free, always able to do the next thing because it never let the last thing tie it down. The plot holes and the longevity are not 2 separate facts about the show. They are the same fact, seen from 2 different sides. So we end where we began, with a talking dog, a talking baby, and a small town in Rhode Island that has never once stayed the same shape twice. The dog has 2 origins and an impossible age. The baby has been 1 year old since the last century. The town has been founded more than once and cannot keep its own street addresses straight, and the family at the center of it has had its parents swapped, its ages scrambled, its members vanished and restored, and its own beginnings rewritten whenever a joke required it. None of it holds together, and none of it was ever meant to. It was meant to be funny, and it was. And that, in the end, is the only thing the show ever truly kept consistent. If this kind of long look at something you grew up with is what you come here for, subscribe. It's free, and it tells us these videos are worth making. See you in the next one.